So I am here with Kristina Marusic, and you are releasing your first book. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So my book comes out on May 11th.
And the title of your book is A New War on Cancer. And what's the second part?
So the title of the book is A New War on Cancer, The Unlikely Heroes Revolutionizing Prevention.
Yes. And so I had the privilege to read your book early, and I thought it was poignant and emotional and powerful and informational and educational. It had so many elements that I would look for personally in a book where I want to learn about an issue that is really complex and can be upsetting, but also providing a lot of nuance. And personal stories are really, I think, helpful in thinking about feeling less hopeless, and just the fact that you included so many amazing stories of amazing people doing work that is making a real difference was really powerful to me. But I would love to hear, just why did you write this book and why is it important to you?
Yeah, thank you so much. So this book, this subject matter is really something that's close to my heart. In 2011, my younger sister Abby was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and she was 25 years old at the time, which is very young for a cancer diagnosis. And thyroid cancer typically runs in families, but no one else in my family had ever had thyroid cancer, and no one else has had it since. So we were really left wondering what kind of environmental exposures might have played a role in her cancer. My sister's doing great now. She had her thyroid removed and she's been in remission for more than a decade. In that decade, she's gotten married and had two beautiful kids who I love being an aunt to, and they live close by, so I get to see them often, which is wonderful. But her diagnosis and treatment really got me thinking about this issue. And then a few years ago, still thinking about this, I wrote a series of stories on cancer and the environment focused on Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, which is where I live, highlighting the ways that air pollution raises our risk for certain types of cancer. And while I was writing that series, I was really surprised to learn that where I live and across the United States and also across the globe, certain types of cancer have been steadily climbing since we started tracking cancer rates methodically in the 1970s. And those include childhood cancer and cancers in young people like my sister, and then also a handful of cancers that are really strongly linked to environmental exposures like multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and testicular cancer. And I interviewed a really smart pediatrician and epidemiologist while I was doing that reporting named Dr. Phil Landrigan. And he said something that was this total light bulb moment for me. So he said, these changes are happening too fast for this to be due to genetic changes. And the basic diagnostic tools for, the most prevalent childhood cancers like childhood leukemia are the same today as they were in the 70s. So this also isn't a matter of just diagnosing more of something that's always been there. So he said this is a real rapid increase in childhood and environmentally linked cancers that we're seeing. And the only other answer is something in our environment. And, that includes things like diet and exercise and smoking, in addition to our exposure to pollutants. But he pointed out that when it comes to kids, they're generally not smoking and drinking, right? And their parents might do those things, but over time, the percentage of parents who smoke and drink during pregnancy or expose their kids to secondhand smoke has dramatically increased, while childhood cancer rates have continued to climb really steadily. So I wrote the book because this issue is really, really close to my heart. And I think a lot of people don't realize that this is happening, like, kind of don't realize that the trends that we're seeing and all the opportunities we have to prevent cancer, particularly for vulnerable people like children, by reducing our exposure to cancer causing chemicals in our everyday lives.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I found really poignant in the book was the emphasis on the narrative for people who get cancer, thinking about how it's their fault and it's their lifestyle choices. And if only they hadn't smoked that one cigarette or had that one extra drink, it wouldn't be their fault. And just understanding through this book that just more and more that no, That's not it. You can do everything right and you can still get cancer, probably just because we're just exposed to so much, even like in the food world. Even though it's mentioned in the book, even if I just eat all organic or I get a water filter that supposedly filters out PFAS, I'm still breathing in chemicals all day long that we could get rid of. And so I would love to know, what did you learn through this process, or what was one of your biggest takeaways from writing the book?
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's a really fine line to walk of wanting to educate people about this, but also not wanting to overwhelm people so much that we just kind of collectively throw up our hands and say, "Oh, everything gives you cancer nowadays, so let's not worry about it at all," which I think is definitely tempting when you start learning this, because it can feel so kind of daunting and overwhelming. But something I took out of away from the experience of writing this book, and that I hope I'm able to convey to readers, is that there are a bunch of really brilliant, really dedicated people who are working very hard on this issue, and there are solutions available that could prevent many, many cases of cancer, and none of us has to start from scratch to be able to contribute to that movement in a meaningful way. So as I was reporting on this, at first I felt overwhelmed, right? Because it's like you said, it's like very kind of scary to figure out just the extent to which we're kind of surrounded by cancer causing chemicals all the time. But then as I met more and more people who work on this issue full time, and I learned, what brought them to the work and why they're so dedicated, and how they spend their days trying to fix this problem we have, it really made me feel hopeful, because they're seeing wins in this battle every day, whether it's in state legislation or federal legislation or market shifts, or even kind of public awareness about these issues, and getting, schools and daycares, for example, to try and reduce the number of carcinogens that kids are exposed to where they're going to learn and play. And so that was my biggest takeaway. The book is really focused on solutions and the people who are fighting for solutions, and what the rest of us can do to contribute and pitch in and do to help out, and try to address these problems in a more systemic way, instead of putting all the pressure on individual people to, be these perfect shoppers who know every bad ingredient to look for, and instead, saying, here's a couple of little things you can do in your life to kind of minimize these exposures. But more importantly, we all need to be pitching in to push for these systemic changes that would protect everyone.
Yeah. Well, and so since writing the book, could you speak at all to any of the newer systemic changes that you've seen? I know there's been a lot of newer legislation in relation to PFAS and just any of the chemicals that you mentioned, if there's anything exciting, motivating you've seen.
Yeah, there's a couple of really exciting new developments. So you mentioned PFAS, and since I wrote the book, the EPA has proposed new limits on PFAS. They're also called forever chemicals in drinking water, and those new proposed limits are hundreds of times lower than the previous recommended limits, which is good. They're following the science, and if those become law, then it'll really change the way that water is filtered in this country in a way that could go a long way toward preventing lots of cases of cancer. And I also wrote in the book about ethylene oxide, which is a highly carcinogenic chemical that's used to sterilize medical equipment. And since the book was printed, the EPA just recently proposed more stringent air emission standards, and also additional protections for workers, which is really important, to reduce cancer risks from ethylene oxide. And the EPA also recently proposed a ban on a chemical called methylene chloride. That's a probable carcinogen that is also dangerous for acute exposures. I was reading just this morning about a young man who died from methylene chloride exposure while he was stripping the paint off his bicycle. So it's, those acute exposures tend to prompt kind of more immediate action than long-term cancer risk does. But so methylene chloride is found in some paint strippers, aerosol paints, adhesives, metal cleaning products, and it's a big deal that the EPA very rarely bans chemicals outright. And so it's exciting that they recently proposed a ban on this, really dangerous chemical. And I know, we all know that change at the federal level often happens really slowly, but these changes I just mentioned are all signs that we're heading in the right direction and that change is possible. So I think they're really promising and they give me a lot of hope.
Yeah, thank you. I want people to hear that, because so much of what we spend in our day to day is just on the negative. And so even myself too, I'm especially in the pesticide world, it's just can be really depressing. So it's good to remember when positive changes are happening too, to help balance out that scale and stay hopeful about change within our like respective focuses. One thing I did want to ask you about was Prop 65 in California. And because right now there's something happening with food where they're trying to get rid of 5 ingredients in food, like red dye through Prop 65, that are really bad in the food. And something that you mentioned in the book, which I've been thinking about a lot, is how if a state decides something that requires a big company or conglomerate to make some major change with regard to a chemical, that has the potential to ripple out to everyone in some way, right? Because if they're forced to take out red dye in California in their products, it's probably easier from an assembly line efficiency perspective to just keep it out of everything.
Yeah, I talked about that in the book, how California specifically has much more stringent chemical regulations on the books than any other state, and certainly than we do at the federal level. And so a lot of times those regulations end up benefiting those of us who don't live in California too, for exactly the reason you said. So if a company wants to be able to sell in all 50 states, it's usually easier to just make all of their products without that potentially harmful chemical, instead of having like a separate set of manufacturing for different states. And we're seeing that happen. I think that's also why it's important not to discount the effectiveness of state level regulation. We've seen some of that with PFAS too, that states that are banning or restricting the use of PFAS, that really can make a difference at the federal level. And with the companies that make products that contain these chemicals. So similarly there, if you are selling a cleaning product that contains PFAS, which I just learned about that one recently, that PFAS is in lots of like carpet stain remover type things. It's just, every day we find out that PFAS is in something new. Environmental Health News had a story yesterday about PFAS in contact
I
lenses,
know,
which is
I saw
also
that.
very alarming. But as states are increasingly, banning their production and use within a given state, that's going to incentivize companies to, use less of those products or not use them at all. So yeah, I think oftentimes we tend to think that real change has to be a federal level ban. And actually these kind of incremental steps and like local ordinances and state regulations can be really effective tools this is gonna be a step-by-step process. It's not gonna happen all in one fell swoop.
I love that, because I think a lot of the times it's just so difficult to think about how you can make a difference. And I think especially people my age and younger, when I was in school, I mean, I took AP Gov, but I didn't take a class about the importance of state or local ordinances and creating a rippling effect. We did not focus on that at all. So I think it's important to be reminded. And even like someone might be hearing this for the first time and not realize that if they just focus, they have a role to play locally if they want to, and how that can impact the collective. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about, because it comes up in the book, is vinyl chloride, and I guess how you've been feeling or what you think the impact is going to be in what has happened in Ohio.
Thank you for asking about this. I think it's such an important issue. So every phase of plastic production, use, and disposal increases our cancer risk. And PVC is the worst, among the most toxic of the plastics, but this is really true for all plastics. So extracting fossil fuels, which are used to make 99% of all plastic products, exposes workers and communities to dozens of carcinogens. And that's true whether they're extracted through fracking or conventional oil wells. Fracking gets a lot of attention, and we tend to forget that conventional oil wells have a lot of the same problems when it comes to emissions and pollution. Then at the next phase of production, facilities that process fossil fuels into the building blocks of plastic also expose workers and communities to a high volume of carcinogens. And then, as we saw in East Palestine, Ohio, transporting these chemicals is extremely risky. And that community in East Palestine, Ohio, has been exposed to a massive load of carcinogens in the air. And we're still waiting on drinking water updates, but communities downstream might also be impacted by those pollutants. And then when it comes to disposal, only 10% of all plastics ever produced are recycled. And so the rest are either incinerated or they get put into landfills or they wind up in the ocean. And all of those options release carcinogens into our air and soil and groundwater and drinking water. And the fossil fuel industry is increasingly turning to plastics as renewable energy becomes cheaper and more widely available, and the transportation sector moves away from fossil fuels, to keep their product profitable. And so a ton of new plastic production facilities have been proposed across the United States. A huge new plant, a Shell ethane cracker, was built about an hour from my home that converts ethane from fracked gas into tiny plastic pellets. They're called nurdles, that are used to make mostly single-use plastic bags and plastic packaging. And that facility has been open for just a couple of months and already exceeded its pollution limits for the year. The community is very worried about their cancer risk from this site. And we're slated to get a lot more of these. Global plastic production is on track to nearly double by 2050 right now. And if that happens, we'll have more of all these things. So more fossil fuel extraction, more processing plants, more transportation of hazardous chemicals through vulnerable communities, and more plastic to burn or bury or pollute our oceans. And all of these things mean more carcinogens in our air, in our water, in our soil, and in our bodies. And that means more cancer. So we absolutely need to do some small legislative steps in the meantime to make trains that transport these kinds of hazardous chemicals safer, but we also desperately need to look at the bigger picture here, and we need to move away from plastics, not toward increased plastic production, and we really need to restrict the amount of new plastic that we're putting into the planet and into our bodies if we want to address this issue.
Yeah, thank you. Some of the upcoming books are all about the plastic crisis, which I'm looking forward to being educated on. And also, there's only so much I want to know about microplastic. But anyway, Kristina, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and for sharing with us today. And I really hope people go and read your book. And also people can find your reporting at Environmental Health News, right?
Yeah. It's ehn.org is where Environmental Health News lives. And there's more information about the book and links to buy it at newwaroncancer.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful talking with you.